G'day everyone and welcome to a special video for the Legal Studies guy. Today we are going to be looking at how to answer longer response questions. Now, I'm going to put the disclaimer out there. This is probably quite a controversial topic amongst VCE Legal Studies teachers. I think every teacher, I suppose, has their different way of explaining this and has different things that they like to see. And different things they like to have put in an answer, which is fair enough. I'm sure if there's some teachers who watch this, you might look at some things and think, oh yeah, that's probably a good idea, and you might look at others and think, no, I don't want my kids to do that. That's fine. Students, if you're watching this and there is perhaps something different in here to what your teacher asks you to do, just remember they are the one that is marking your SACs. But I suppose I do want to put forward the idea of or the point that this is the way I've been teaching my kids to do it for a number of years now. Without, I suppose, floating my own boat a bit, we have outperformed the state on longer response questions every year that I've been teaching legal studies. So there is some evidence to suggest that this sort of methodical approach to it is what will get you some good marks. And obviously I'll talk at the end about how this is the greatest opportunity to move ahead of other people on the exam. So what I've done to look through this is we're going to go through a bit of a template. I'll talk at the end about how you don't want to be going through in this much detail every time you do it, but trying to give you the basic essence of what a longer response question needs and how you can plan that out. To do that, I have included a sample question which we'll be using. That question is, evaluate the extent to which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking, including with regards to express rights. So for 6 marks, longer response questions generally being 5+ marks, although occasionally you get some 4 markers that ask you to discuss or evaluate as well. But evaluate the extent to which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking. So, let's go through the process. Absolutely, number one, the most important thing to do is work out what the task word is straight away. That should be the first thing you look at. Don't worry about the content. And generally, these 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, are the 4 most likely or most common ones you'll see. They are particularly evaluate, discuss, and analyse used in the study design as key skills. And each of these task words tells us exactly what the question wants from us. So for an evaluator, to what extent? You want to look at the evidence for both sides of the prompt. So the prompt will always have 2 sides to it. And come to a value judgment. So evaluate, you are coming to a value judgment, hence the word value being in there. So an overall argument on the worth of the prompt. It's the same for to what extent, because they're asking you to come to what extent, so come to a value judgment. Discuss and analyze are a little bit different. They generally don't need a value judgment. They just need you to exchange evidence for both sides, unless they explicitly ask for it. So sometimes you might get a question that says something along the lines of, discuss the extent. So therefore, you are going to want to make a quick statement at the end about the extent to which you either agree or disagree. So for this question, evaluate the extent to which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament. We know that we need to look at evidence for both sides, so how it does act as a check, but also how it doesn't act as a check, and then come to an overall judgment about whether the Australian Constitution acts as a check or not. The second thing to then think about is how many points do you need to make? So how many paragraphs do you need, or how many pieces of evidence do you need to make? And I have a really, really simple way of going about this. If X equals the amount of points you need to make, and we're going to do a little bit of algebra here, as if you'll ever need it, pretty simply I just do this. How many marks is the question worth? Divided by 2 plus 1. The general idea being that if you write a full paragraph or a full point about a piece of evidence, about a point you're making, general rule, let's say that that's worth 2 marks. So in a 6-mark question, if you do 3 of those, really, really well, about 2 marks each, you're potentially looking at 6 marks. Now, working out what you get for a longer response question isn't as simple as that, but the idea of 3 points for 6 marks is kind of on the money. You should be spot on. Why I then add the +1 is the idea that if one of your pieces of evidence isn't as strong as it could be, if you don't explain it as well as you could, making sure that you have that extra piece to then back up your answer more. What this means is half the marks +1, that if the question is worth 6 marks, you want to make 4 points, which is the question we're about to do. If it's a 10 marker, you probably want to make 6 points, or 6 pieces of evidence is what you're going for. So in this one, we now know that we need to come to a value judgment at the end, and we need to put 4 points in. So we'll talk about that in a moment. What is the question about? Let's go back up. The extent to which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament. So Constitution all checks on Parliament. So if we remember from the study design, and obviously in the exam you're going to have to be able to pull this straight up into your head, this is dot point 4.1.4, and constitutional checks on Parliament that it gives us are express rights, the separation of powers, double majority or referendums, and it also gives us the bicameral structure of Parliament and the role of the High Court. So just straight away, okay, you know what the task word is, you know how many points you need to make, then you start looking at, okay, what content do I need to use? A really important thing though is this, making sure that you look at if there are any specific points you need to include. So if we look at this answer, evaluate the extent to which, or this question, to which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament, it tells us here, including with regards to express rights. So straight away we know, are there any specific points you need to address? Yep, we need to include express rights. So once we've gone through those 4 steps, we can then look at, therefore, what does a complete answer need? Well, we need to make 4 points / pieces of evidence. One of these needs to be about express rights because it's explicitly asked for it. And we need to have an overall value judgment / argument. Pretty simple, okay? The idea is that that's taken us a few minutes to go through, and more than a few minutes, we're already at the 8-minute mark. But the idea that that's going to become really intuitive to you. You're going to be able to see it and be like, bang, 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 know exactly what my answer needs. Then we need to plan our evidence, okay? So this is where we actually look at what content we are specifically going to include, and we know that we are looking at the extent to which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament. So we need to look at this from the viewpoint of, how is it a check on Parliament, but how isn't it a check on Parliament? Rub that out. We definitely know that we have to include express rights. So one of the first things I'm going to do when I look at the evidence I'll include is express rights are a check on Parliament because we know Parliament can't legislate in areas of express rights. But we know that it's not really a check because express rights are limited. Okay? So all of a sudden we're starting to build our answer. They're 2 really distinct points. But double majority means Parliament can't just go and change the Constitution whenever they want. So the Constitution is a check on Parliament in lawmaking. But in order for express rights, and I've already got an answer prepared, hence why I'm just ripping out bits of evidence, kind of, I suppose, from my rear end. But we know that for a law to be invalidated for breaching express rights, because express rights are enforceable, for a law to be invalidated by the High Court for breaching express rights, it has to be actually brought to the court in the first place by someone with standing. So it isn't really a check on Parliament in the sense of it already exists. So the point I'm going to make is someone with standing must bring a case. Let's have a look. We need to make 4 points. 1, 2, 3, 4. We know we need both sides because it's an evaluate, and we need one about express rights, which we have here. And then we just need to make sure that when we write out our answer, we have an overall conclusion. The next step, one of the really, really important parts, is an answer needs to have flow. It needs to link together really well. So the next step before you start writing is to work out which order you want to present your evidence in. You need to use words like however and whereas to change sides, so if you're talking about one side and then the other, and words like further and in addition if you're continuing your evidence. So if I look at this, say if I start that express rights are a check on Parliament, the immediate thing I'm going to go to straight away is then be like, however, express rights are actually limited. There's not many of them and they don't have great scope. Therefore, not a check on Parliament. Then I might say, further to this, someone with standing must bring a case to actually get this legislation invalidated. I'm talking about the role of the High Court a little bit there. And then I might come back to double majority at the end. So just organising what flow I'm going to get so that I can make sure my answer links together really well. Once we've done all of these things, it's then that we get to the point where we actually write our answer. Okay? It's so important that you actually plan this and you don't just jump in and try and write it on the fly. Because as soon as you write it on the fly, you're not going to have evidence that flows together really well. You're not going to actually... We know with this, there's 5 different checks, constitutional checks on Parliament in lawmaking, or 5 different areas they've given it. So there's about 15 different bits of evidence I could use. And without actually planning it out and figuring out what the best pieces are to get a good flow together and make a good argument, we're not going to write the best answer that we can. So it's really important that we do all of these things before we start writing, and only then do we get to the point where we actually write out our answer. When we write out our answer, there's a structure to this as well, and a structure you should look to use. What happens is a lot of people fall into the habit of just identifying or stating the evidence, and just writing a couple of sentences and then leaving it at that. But what we actually need to do is we need to state or identify the evidence, then actually explain what it means, and then expand on it. Okay? How does it actually relate to the prompt? How is it actually a check? Or how is it actually not a check? How is it actually a strength? How is it actually a weakness? As opposed to just insinuating or assuming that the examiner will know these things. Okay? Really simple structure to use. Often it means you've just got to write 3 sentences. Okay? State it, explain it, expand it, and you're done. You could write this out in an acronym as C. I often say identify, expand, explain. IEE. Whichever works for you to remember it. But it's pretty straightforward. If I'm talking about express rights, one way that the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking is through the existence of express rights. Done. All I do there is I just state express rights are a check on Parliament. I don't provide anything else. Then I explain what this means. Express rights are those that are explicitly written into the Constitution, such as Section 116, which provides a limited freedom of religion, and they can only be altered or removed through a referendum. So explain, what is an express right? Okay, you can't assume that the examiner knows that. And then the really, really important part, and this is what makes an answer great. Not just good, this is what makes an answer great. I'm actually going to link this to the prompt. I'm going to explain how it is a check. Express rights act as a check on Parliament, as Parliament is not able to make laws that infringe on these rights, as they will be declared invalid by the High Court. There is really, really explicitly stated why express rights are a check. Okay, I've said express rights are a check. This is what express rights are, and this is how. And that's the really, really big thing we're answering with our expand part is how is it a check? How is it a strength? How is it a weakness? Do that for each of your 4 pieces here. State, explain, expand. Okay, and then you should be able to put together a complete answer provided you get the flow and make sure that you link together, which I'm going to show you in a minute. You should, at the end of this, try and link back to your prompt if possible, or link to the next piece of evidence. As much as you probably hate it and maybe remember it from year 7 or 8 or whatever, this is very, very similar to TEAL. You're stating your topic, you're explaining it, you're expanding it, and then you're linking it back to the prompt. You're effectively writing TEAL paragraphs. What does this look like in a whole answer? Well, you can see here, if I can get this to slide, that paragraph that we just looked at, that paragraph that we just looked at is here. One way the Australia Constitution acts as a check on Parliament is through express rights. Done. Already done that. Notice how then I go to a bit of evidence from the other side. However, so I get good flow in my answer. However, despite restricting the lawmaking of Parliament in some areas, express rights are limited in both number and scope. So I've stated that. There are only 5 express rights included in the Constitution, and they deal mainly with practical matters such as freedom of interstate trade and just terms for property acquisition. So I've explained what I mean by limited in scope, and then I've expanded. I've gone ahead to say how this isn't a check. This means that express rights only provide a limited check as they do not cover broad human rights such as freedom of association and freedom of expression. So, stated, explained, expanded. I continue that argument further to this. Legislation which breaches express rights to be declared invalid, someone must first bring a case. Stated. In order to bring a case, so I've explained, and then bringing a case is time consuming and expensive, therefore it's actually a limited check. So I've expanded. Finally, I say despite these issues with express rights, so changing back to the other side, as stated earlier, they can be only altered or removed through a referendum. So stated. Referendums are required. This is what a referendum is. Double majority. Explained. 2 sentences there. This acts as a check on Parliament as it means that they cannot alter the Constitution to remove any checks on their power without the consent of the public. So expanded. Pretty simple. And then ultimately I include my value judgment. The Constitution only somewhat acts as a check on Parliament. This is because they can't legislate in areas of express rights and they can't remove these rights. However, the requirement for standing as well as the limited scope of express rights means that they only provide a limited check on Parliament. So I have an overall value judgment. Look, at the end of the day, as I said to start, this is a complex area and every teacher has a slightly different way of going about longer response questions. What's important is that you find a method that works for you, because at the end of the day, a 6-mark question on the exam, if you look purely from a numbers viewpoint, you only have 9 minutes on that. 9 minutes to write out an answer like this. Okay? And just explaining that, we're almost at the 20-minute mark already. So you have 9 minutes, which means that this sort of stuff, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, needs to become really intuitive. You need to be able to look at a question and straight away be like, I know how many points I need to make, I know exactly what I need to put in it, and I can start planning. You don't want to be wasting time trying to work through that process, because otherwise your 9 minutes is going to run out way too quickly, and you're going to want to spend as much of that writing as possible. Obviously, you might have, or you should have a little bit longer than 9 minutes. You should be trying to knock over your 2 and 3 mark questions quicker so that you can spend a little bit of extra time on the 6, the 8s, the 10s. But at the end of the day, you need to actually do as much practice as possible so that these things only take 30 seconds. Okay, and the only way you're going to get through it so that these things are really, really intuitive is if you actually practice those longer response questions. At the end of the day, when you get to the exam, if you've spent all your time getting really good at 2, 3, 4 markers, and you do those really, really well and you get full marks on them, say, for example, you get full marks on a 2-mark question and someone does a half-assed job and they get 1, you've only got 1 extra mark than them. But if you focused and practiced these longer response questions, particularly the 10-marker, and you do a good answer that gets a 7 or 8 and someone does a half-assed answer that gets a 2 or a 3, you've actually gained 4 or 5 marks there, as opposed to only picking up 1 for the shorter questions. So at the end of the day, doing this well is the absolute most important thing you can do in legal studies in order to get a good score. And look, go over the old examiners reports. Pretty much for the last 5 or 6 years, the 10-mark question, the average answer has only been 4 or 5 out of 10. So they're generally done really poorly. So if you're dedicated enough and you do the work and you do these well, this is where you win. This is where you pick up your marks on the exam, and this is where you smash other kids out of the water. Hopefully that's been helpful in some way. If I can clarify it all, please get in touch, or particularly leave some comments below or comments over on the Facebook page. It'd be great to get a bit of a discussion going about what a longer response question needs, and we'll go from there. Hopefully this has been helpful in some way, shape or form. Make sure to subscribe as always to keep up to date with things, and happy studying.